Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I decided to film this video because after my recent colorings, when I did a rabbit in Daydreams or several birds and animals in Australian Animals book, I received comments which made me really sad. People wrote that they are so afraid to color animals and especially fur that they even not start pictures with animals because they know that they won't be able to color animals in a realistic way. And I decided that I will show you my progress from my first picture of the animal to my recent ones in order to confirm to show you that everything is possible if you practice and if you try to learn during coloring process. My coloring path is already quite long because I color more than 3 years already. I think it's 4 now. And let me introduce my first ever colored animal, this poor cat. I used Derwent ink tens here, then I tried to create some texture, but still, let's be honest, she is awful. In the beginning, I also was quite afraid to select pictures with animals. I also realized that I didn't have any skills to do realistic fur. Sometimes I colored pictures where animals were represented in more decorative way, or I simply colored them by using main color of the animal but not thinking about doing any texture. At least in my next book, and it's also one of my earliest works, I already started to think about shading. You can see that upper part of the body is slightly lighter and bottom part, which gets a smaller amount of light, it's slightly darker, but of course there is no any fur texture. The same thing goes to the next book, which also was one of my first coloring books I've owned. You can see that if there was texture on the tails of the squirrels, then I colored it, but on the bodies I even hadn't tried to create any fur. I simply thought about shading and about using main colors which we can see for the squirrels. They don't look very awful, but they also don't look realistic, so it was a beginning of my coloring journey. Another huge problem which really prevented me from starting coloring realistic animals was that if the whole shape, the whole look of the animal in the book wasn't very realistic, like sometimes we have in books by Hannah Carson. I also didn't know how to convert them into realistic looking, and you can clearly see it here. Again, it's one of my earliest works, and you can see that here I thought about colors, about shading, but definitely not about texture. And I also want to show you another ugly cat. It's from Maria Trolle book, and it's completely ruined the whole picture. Here I tried to use some paints, but they didn't help me a lot. First thing which really helped me to start actually coloring full texture was after I started to combine mediums with colored pencils. It was very hard for me to draw individual hairs. But when I started to do first layers with watercolors, then I was able to draw texture and individual hairs with colored pencils, and you can see couple of my earlier works. It's in Game of Thrones coloring book, and they all are made in the same technique. First I used watercolors to indicate main colors on the animal's fur, and then second layer was made with pencils, and in such cases even soft pencils like Prismacolors were able to draw texture. The same technique I used in Kirby Razane's books to draw animals in Kirby book is quite easy because he already indicates direction of the fur growth, length of the fur, so we already have pre-drawn texture. So Kirby is one of the best books where you can start practicing coloring animals. And again here I used first watercolors, and on top of watercolors it was much easier to draw texture comparing to simply layering pencils on the regular paper in coloring books. I think that it was my main problem when I started to draw texture, that very quickly I wasn't able to layer my pencils and I wasn't able to draw those thin hairs of the texture because usually I work with soft pencils, with creamy pencils, and they are not very helpful, especially as we work on medium paper. So I first discovered this way by doing watercolor underpaint and on working on top of it with pencils. And also on this picture I discovered that maybe the hardest fur to draw for beginners is white one. So white animals I consider the top difficulty in coloring all furs. When I realized that I don't know how to draw full texture with my colored pencils, I decided to concentrate my efforts into doing realistic shading, but without doing full texture. Here is a nice example. You can see that I already tried to use several shades of colors to show which parts of the animal is more highlighted, which parts of the animal body are more in the shading. I tried to combine various colors which are traditional for each of the animals, but mostly my animals don't have full texture because everything here is created with Prismacolors, and as I said, on the smooth and average quality paper which we have in coloring books, to draw full texture is really a problem. Another good example is here. You can see that on the areas where fur was indicated by Tomislav Tomic, so with typographic paint, there is some hints to the fur texture. And at that moment I already tried to draw fur, but not for the short fur animals. For I was able to draw fur where on the areas where it's quite long, but mostly again on maybe for a year or even 2 years I concentrated on doing realistic shading, and I really hadn't tried to draw full texture. Next thing which I realized for myself, it's as I said that it's very complicated for me to color animals in books like Hannah Carson or Maria Trolle, and it's much easier to color them if they are already represented in a realistic way. So I consider books by Kanoka Yugusa as one of the best to practice because she draws them in very realistic way, and she already indicates direction of the fur growth, so it's very helpful for beginners. And another book which I consider very helpful is Australian Animals by Selina Fenech. I forgot to show you another one of my earliest works. It's Mouse, where I tried to create texture using some white gel pen, even if mouse is black. And for a long time I was able to create, the only texture I was able to create is by using white gel pen. And if animal didn't have any white furs, then it was a problem for me. I really was afraid to draw fur texture. On my earlier pictures you can clearly see that I did fur texture only near the sides near the lines which outline the shape of the animals, but there is no fur texture in the central part. And for a long time, it also was one of my ways to draw animals near the shape of the animal where it's already pre-printed for texture. Then I added some pencil strokes to add texture, but in the central part I simply covered the animal's body with a plain layer of color. Then I started to mix various pencil brands and even various mediums in order to create texture. And couple of cats in Magical Dawn I consider as my first very successful works. Here I really started to layer, to work patiently, and I developed my own method by starting with working with softer pencils to cover the main areas of the body to add main colors, and then switching to harder pencils I tried to draw texture. Or sometimes I switched to paints or felt tip pens, so for anything which was able to draw on top, to draw thin lines on top of the already colored animal. And you can see difference between my first pictures in books by Hannah Carson. Here is the difference between my first picture in book by Emily Lindehall Oberg. You can also see that there is no texture on mice. Here only main colors and main shading. And then on my last pictures I already started to draw realistic fur, and again I combined several pencil brands and I added additional mediums to draw that texture. So step by step I developed those tricks and methods how to work on average quality paper, which mediums to combine, how to add colors, which colors to use when you need to draw white fur or black fur. But for beginners I would recommend to start from brown, ginger or gray animals. For me they were much easier to color comparing to the black ones and to the white ones. The same thing goes to coloring birds. I would say that to do birds is almost the same as to do animals. Sometimes birds are even easier because usually feathers are thicker and bigger comparing to the very thin hairs on the fur texture. I think that my first successful animals were when I combined brown and gray colors on the fur. In this way, by combining two colors, it's easy to show various uh, textures on the body on the animal to show that in several areas fur is longer, that fur varies in the direction of the growth. And usually I always start my coloring by looking at various reference pictures, and I always analyze which main colors I have on the animal body, which additional color accents I can find in the fur. As I said, I also try to memorize direction of the fur growth and how long is fur on each of the uh, on each part of the animal's body. And the last thing is, don't try to be very hard on yourself, especially when you compare pictures which real artists create with the same pencils which you use, but on professional paper, because it's a huge difference. When we color in coloring books, where we are very limited in amount of layers which we can apply in order to create realistic texture, realistic fur. And when you work on much more professional paper which artists used, I really felt it when I recently colored White Rabbit. It was last month on the toned paper, and it was much easier than doing similar animals but in coloring books. So not everything depends from you. Sometimes it depends from the mediums you use. Now, when I feel that I am unable to layer more, that I already used all my soft and hard pencils, then I try to use additional mediums like paint and tiny brush or Posca pens or markers or felty pens or sometimes even regular ball pen. I hope that when you saw the difference between my first pictures and between my recent pictures, which of course are far from the uh, really realistic images, but at least where full texture is more visible. I hope that it was helpful, that now maybe you feel less discouraged to try to practice coloring full, because to color animals is really very interesting and there is a lot of beautiful books with animals. So please practice. Please don't be discouraged from your first not very successful attempts. Please learn your mediums which you can combine for creating this texture by layering them, and then in the end your animals will be fluffy and very realistic.